On this episode of Book Reports Podcast,
Bryce doesn't understand money.
our guest, Chevy Chase,
Macho Man Randy Savage.
Sam talks sports,
Knott's Berry Farm, the not-so-magic kingdom.
Toto references,
And much, much more.
Believe it or not, I'm walking on air. I never thought I could be so free. Flying away on a wing and a prayer. Who could it be? Believe it or not, it's Book Reports Podcast. Welcome. My name is Bryce, American Hero Diener.
And I'm Sam Airwolf Tyler. Don't know the theme of it, though, so I can't really, can't back up my words with my fists.
I think it was just a kazoo solo.
Yeah, that famous kazoo Airwolf theme. The one everyone's humming these days.
So, last episode we had JC on, and he said he was very worried that we were recording episodes by ourselves. Much like a dog returning to its vomit, we've returned to our old pattern, just Sam and Bryce.
I have a question we usually ask the guest.
How did you get in here?
Yeah, what are you doing here? We're trying to record a podcast, buddy. Get out. I have a question to ask you. You have certain things in a book that you enjoy. Usually if it's broken up tightly into small sections.
Yes.
That's something that you tend to really highlight when you review a book. That doesn't, however, carry over into fiction. You haven't brought a short story book to the podcast yet, which would, I think, be very much in your oeuvre. Do you not read short stories? Like, what's the barrier?
I mean,
there?
I'll be honest, I don't know that I've ever actually set out to find any.
Interesting. You read Beetle the Bard, which is a short story book.
Well, I mean, it's definitely broken up into stories. Beetle the Bard, written by J.K. Rowling as part of the Harry Potter universe. It's written as a children's book, which I think is a great children's book just the way it is. And so parents, even though you don't think your kids are ready for Harry Potter just yet, definitely go out, find Beetle the Bard. There's a lot of good, kind of like Cinderella or like the Three Bears. Cinderella and Three Bears, yeah.
That's my favorite one. So that's more like a bear trap.
Just different stories like that, but in terms of like the Harry Potter universe. So if you're a big Harry Potter fan and you want to get your kids into it, that's a good place to start if they're a little young.
Okay. You don't tend to bring fiction as well. And I think one reason why maybe you don't go into short stories is because
they're lies.
Because they're
Small
all lies. Maybe you don't have authors that you're following when it comes to fiction, and that usually leads into the short fiction quite often.
Yeah,
I think, too.
I'd agree with that.
That's why I was thinking about Beetle the Bard as an example of short fiction that you have to have read because it's J.K. Rowling.
Thanks for the intervention.
It's time, Bryce. It's time. Your father and I are worried about you, son.
Now, listeners, if you're listening and you think, hey, I love this short story, go ahead, comment below with a book title and the author. Let us know. Maybe I'll read it in the future.
You're becoming lazier when it comes to choosing books. That's all there is to it, Bryce. First, the voting for what book you're doing next.
Who wants to read a book for me and just tell me what it was? And then I'll mention it on air.
That's a great idea. Oh. Yeah, my book report today is provided by a listener, thankfully. So
by Elizabeth, age 9.
Thank you, Elizabeth. I can't read this. It's in crayon. Yeah.
So I have been playing with this idea of bringing a nonfiction book. I have a couple sports books, actually, mostly baseball because I'm a baseball fan. And I'm wondering, is there a sport that you would be interested in hearing about? I know you're not big into any sports yourself. Is there something that even you might be, that tickles your fancy?
Not a specific sport. But I think if you were to bring a book detailing some major event in sports that had lots of ramifications, that would be interesting. I'm thinking specifically of the Olympics. I think if you were to bring... Have you heard of this?
No.
Mount Olympics? It's where the gods play sports.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Like Kilimanjaro rises like the Olympics above the Serengeti, like Toto says.
That's exactly right. I think something major.
Did you stop an old man along the way hoping to find some long forgotten words or ancient melodies?
Oddly enough, no. That was the last place I looked. As somebody who cares about sports about as much as I do the freckle on my back that I never see, I would have to say I think anything that in sports that made the world very, very different, or something that, like, if you do a book about the Negro Leagues, for example, or...
Well, it's funny.
Why'd I open my big mouth?
Well, it's funny you say that because I do have a book that I've been wanting to read. Sam, I'm glad you brought that up. It's about a guy named Rube Foster, who's actually a player but also an owner of one of the Negro League teams. He's considered one of the greatest players of all time, but he doesn't get mentioned in the names like Babe Ruth or Lou Gehrig or all these big names in baseball because he was in the Negro League and he was discriminated against simply because of the color of his skin. Had they been in the Major League Baseball, they would have been right up there with people like Babe Ruth. Mickey Mantle, Lou Gehrig, all these.
But I would say anything that is tangentially related to sports and is still interesting would be of interest to me. So like I think cheating scandals, for example, that'd be a good one.
There you go. So like the 1920 Black Sox.
Exactly right. That's what I was thinking of. Anything involving Andre the Giant, I would be fine with. The story behind professional wrestling, considering how much crazy stuff there is involved in it, I think that would be interesting. I mean, there's certainly lots of crazy stories behind that, I'm sure.
One of the fun things I liked, I watched that Andre the Giant documentary.
Oh, yeah.
He had mentioned, like, these guys, they make it look like you're hurting the other individual, but they do it in a way that doesn't physically like break them or something like that, so they can go on to their next fight. Andre the Giant hated Macho Man Randy Savage, and he actually set out to hurt him every time that they versed. He thought he was just too arrogant.
Oh, that's funny. Instead of, oh yeah, it was, oh no.
Welcome to Booker Boards Podcast, brother.
We're doing some kind of podcasting right here. Oh, yeah. Talk about books, brother.
Step into a Slim Jim.
So this month, I decided to really step outside of the box and cover a topic that we have never had the guts to discuss before in this podcast.
Audacity.
I'm talking about World War II.
Out of left field is where this is coming from.
Please, War II? Don't turn it off. I guarantee it will be interesting. Don't worry. I know you usually think in World War II, what a boring subject. But I read Zhukov, The Rise and Fall of a Great Captain by William J. Spahar. S-P-A-H-R. Spahar?
Okay. Subpar.
Subpar. William J. Subpar. But his mom says he's trying. Zhukov is sort of the Russian general that, even going into the Cold War, he was the guy that Eisenhower liked.
Okay.
When Eisenhower was president, this Zhukov was the guy he would get in contact with to talk to the Russian government.
So he was a captain, like he wasn't actually like a general?
Well, he started as a captain and moved on from there.
Okay.
Yeah. No, the Russian military only goes up to captain. It's the highest. It's all about everybody being equal in communism and working together, so it isn't as much hierarchy. No, he was much more than a captain. His career goes all the way back to the Russian Civil War. He had a very low-class upbringing, so he was very, very popular among the communists as a military strategist. He really rose to distinction at that war and was able to just rise to the ranks and sort of became somebody that everybody went, yeah, Zhukov, he's pretty good at this soldiering thing. And Zhukov just kind of rose to the ranks until he reached the point where he was in charge of the entire Russian military establishment. And this is the rise and fall of Zhukov. There are actually two different falls during his life that we'll cover in a second.
Down the stairs.
Yeah, down the stairs and down a well. And Lassie had to come save him. In 1937, the Russian army had a massive purge, which is where Stalin went, you're dying, and you're gonna die, and you're gonna die, and you're gonna die. And then all these really important officers just got wiped out for not towing the party line, or being people that Stalin didn't like, or being people that were close to Stalin didn't like. All these people were just wiped out, and you lost basically an entire generation of officers who had lots of experience and were able to lead their men effectively into battle, leaving Zhukov and some other guys. So because of that, they all got promoted pretty quickly up through the ranks. And this is just before World War II breaks out. Okay. And, Stalin has the treaty with Germany that they're not going to attack. Germany then attacks, and so they have to really quickly go, oh crap, we need a lot more of an army. Go, 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 go. And so Zhukov was one of the guys that was instrumental in standing in that gap and delaying the Eastern Front from moving towards Moscow so that they could build up an actual air force. He was in charge of the defense of Moscow, and the Germans got really, really close. If I recall correctly, it was within 20 miles. He was able to repel them, and they continued the fight. He rose to the ranks and eventually became, I think he was Grand Marshal of Soviet forces.
The parade.
He was basically in charge of all of the land forces, period. And Zhukov was very, very proud and was going to say what he felt needed to be said. Even when he's talking to Stalin, he would go into meetings and he'd be the only person saying, no, actually, sir, that's really stupid. We shouldn't do that. And everybody else is just kind of going, Stalin. We
got a good thing going here,
come
Zhukov.
Yeah. Don't rock the boat, Zhukov.
Did Stalin respect him enough that he would actually consider his points, or was it...
Yes and no. What would happen is Stalin would yell at Zhukov and dismiss him, and then a couple days later just say, yeah, we'll do what you said. It came to the point where I think Stalin realized that Zhukov was obviously his best general, and so he really needed him to be between Stalin and Germany. He kept him running the military, and it kept working until after the Russians reached Berlin. At that point, Stalin decided, well, we just won this war. Zhukov isn't as important as he used to be. So he brought Zhukov into Moscow. dressed him down in front of everybody. He was accused of looting, creating basically a cult of personality, of overestimating what he did in World War II, and for becoming too full of himself and not towing the party line. So he was demoted down to a lesser military position. He was in charge of defense in the Urals, and he was also in charge of the defense in Odessa. So these are two areas that they're not really important right now. These are third rate. He went from being in charge of everything to just taking care of small spots that aren't as important.
So the stuff that Stalin accused him of, was he actually guilty of any of that?
He did take some trophies during the war. Actually, the secret police, this would be the Cheka. Would it be the Cheka yet? NKVD or the Cheka? I can't remember which it is. They raided his household and took away everything that was worthy of keeping in his household, including his daughter's toys. They just raided the place and took anything of value and left. He was humiliated publicly and just dismissed away. This is, I think, 1946. And during this time, Stalin is just kind of resting on his laurels and is trying to take over as much of Europe as possible. Then, just before Stalin dies, he decides, you know what? I don't think Zhukov's that much of a threat. Let's bring him back up. He is a pretty valuable guy. So he was promoted back up again.
Okay.
And this is just before Stalin dies. Now, when Stalin dies, all the people that are directly beneath him start garnering to be like, I'm going to be the next Stalin. It's going to be me. Now, the main guy who was really jockeying that position is a guy named Levin T. Beria. I think I'm saying his name right. And Beria is awful. Beria is one of those people in history that it's like, man, if I ever met him, I would have punched him. Beria is awful. He was in charge of the secret police at this point in time, which I think was the Cheka. I think it's called the Cheka. But Beria is awful, and he's jockeying to become in charge. And there are people high up in the Russian government who he has imprisoned and tortured to be able to
and they're out?
Get stuff out of them. Okay. They were put back into government, but they're all terrified of Beria because they've spent months or years in one of his prisons.
Sure.
So everybody's terrified of Beria. Now, another guy is Khrushchev. And if you haven't heard the name Khrushchev, go read a book, you filthy Philistine. Very, very high up in the Communist Party and part of the inner circle as well. And so he decides, I would much rather be in charge than have Beria be in charge. Let's get rid of Beria. So he makes a deal with a bunch of the other guys in the inner circle to have Beria arrested. And Zhukov is the guy who arrests him. Give him a trial and he's executed.
Oh, wow.
And the person who gains and becomes the next man in charge of all of Russia is Khrushchev. Zhukov, who helped him, also rises to the top and becomes minister of the army.
Remind me, is Khrushchev the one with that giant...
No, that's Gorbachev.
Pockmark on his head?
The giant flower in his lapel it would squirt people with. The giant personality. The huge personality. As I said before, there were two falls for Zhukov. So he is back on top again, probably the third most powerful man. This is the very, very beginning of the Cold War. So Zhukov and Eisenhower got along great during World War II. So Zhukov is kind of the person that when Eisenhower wants to talk to the Russian government, he reaches out to Zhukov. Zhukov is at the height of his power. He's an incredibly important man in charge of everything involving the military now. And then, in 1957, once again, Khrushchev and the inner circle decide Zhukov's getting too powerful. We gotta get rid of him. So they do the exact same thing to him again. And they throw him away to the side and he goes into exile. Oh, by the way, his first name is Georgy, by the way. Since I learned how to pronounce that, I wanted to be sure to do it at least once during this. So Georgy Konstantinovich Zhukov. But he dies in exile in 1974. It's the main narrative of this book. It's just the story of Zhukov's life. But what I found most interesting about this book is that there is a meta-narrative. There is another story on top of that one.
Oh.
This book is about Soviet history, and it was written by an American in 1993, so just a few years after the fall of the Soviet Union. Which means that he's writing it at a very interesting time. He's writing it very soon after America starts being able to have actual access to Soviet history archives. Up until this point, all the information we had about World War II was from the German point of view, because that's whose records we had. We weren't really given access to Russian records, oddly enough, during the Cold War. So this is written at a very, very strange time where he has new access to stuff. The best example of this is Zhukov wrote memoirs, all about his time in World War II and his life. In 1993, this is right after the 10th edition of these memoirs were released. 1 through 9 were released under the Soviet regime. So a lot of things in those memoirs have been tweaked or altered or rewritten so that they follow the party line. Remember in Soviet Russia, memoir, right? In Soviet Russia, you have to toe the party line. And what's true is dependent entirely on what the party says is true. So the first 9 editions of his memoir were full of weird little errors that aren't true but were put in by the Soviets. For example, before Khrushchev came to power, Bulganin was in charge of Russia. And at one point in his memoirs, Zhukov was asked, well, could you put in something about wanting to talk to Bulganin for his perspective on the war during the war, get some strategy from him? He's like, why? He was nowhere close to me. He wasn't even in the chain of command of the military. Why would I ask him for strategy? And like, we'll just put it in. So at one point in the book, it says, I think it was during the defense of Stalingrad, it says, I wish to be able to discuss the strategy with Comrade Bulganin, but he was unavailable at the time. And so that's his little way of having to put Bulganin's name somewhere in the book.
Right.
During another printing, during Khrushchev's reign, he had this to really kiss up to Khrushchev and to have nice things about Khrushchev in the book. Well, and this is true during Zhukov's life. What people can say about Zhukov and what they can print about him in the papers depends on who's in charge and where he falls in the party's view of how people should be living. So Zhukov's legend vacillates during his own life about what he did during World War II. For example, I read one book about the defense of Stalingrad written by Choykov, who was in charge of the defense of Stalingrad, who was below Zhukov, and Zhukov was in charge of him. Zhukov never gets a mention in that book because it's during one of his exiles it was written.
Oh, okay.
You have this really strange thing doing research for this book of, in this edition, this story exists, but this is during this reign, so we know it's not true. So we look at this story from somebody else's memoir, and that doesn't match this story at all, so let's see who were they kowtowing to when they said this. And so you have to compare all these relative truths that are all dependent entirely on who's in charge right now. And that is such an interesting meta-narrative of what it's like to do research on a book about something from the Soviet Union.
And you said that was volumes 1 through 9. You said there's a 10th one?
The 10th one was the way Zhukov wrote it because it was put out after the Soviet Union fell.
Interesting. So that's probably the closest to the truth that we have.
It is. But even then, we don't have fantastic information all the time. In this book, the first 43 years of Zhukov's life are covered on the first 30 pages. That is all that he had access to be able to learn about Zhukov's first 43 years. Those first 43 years, coincidentally, are before World War II. So there's just this tiny smattering of information on this man's life. Now, I'd be curious to see, it's not 1993 anymore, oddly enough. If that was a shock to you listeners, find somebody else to work a computer
change
for you.
Change that calendar on your fridge.
Yes. I know it's a cute picture of Garfield, but you should change it. You can't just keep a calendar based on the picture.
Hang in there as he's on a piece of
I hate Mondays.
lasagna.
Get a real calendar, folks.
Do you think that anything more could have been added to this book, or is there something that should have been left out? So
I think it would have been nice to get more of his first 43 years than 30 pages. You don't get much mention of his home life until the very, very end of the book where they give this quick overview of, and he had kids. I thought that was very strange. Just some weird little bits and pieces that I thought were frustrating. I think this is the biggest flaw in this book, is this book has maps.
Oh.
Everyone likes maps, right?
I do.
Not when they look like this.
Oh my word. Okay.
He has these massive military maps shrunk down to fit on one page, and they are illegible.
So listeners, let me once again describe a photo to you.
With the dulcet tones wrapped around your ears. I hope you're wearing headphones.
If you ever looked at like a subway map, like if you got on like on the metro, this is what it kind of looks like, but then they've zoomed out on the entire city of New York, and you still have to figure out where your next metro stop is. You can't read the cities, and they're in English. So, honestly, I don't even know what country I'm looking at right now.
Well, that's the thing. I'm not familiar with this.
It says Baltic Sea above it, and so it says Berlin right there.
Yeah, this is supposed to be a map of the rush to Berlin. It is unreadable. I mean, it's showing troop movements. You're supposed to be able to understand the troop movements. You can't even make out the scale on the map. Just either have the map take up 2 pages or retype the map. That's not hard to do. I do it myself for my blog. It's not hard to make a map legible, but these maps are just terrible. They are completely useless. It would have been nice to know what the heck Zhukov was doing, because in a military campaign, when you're describing and saying he moved here and the left flank moved over here, it's nice to have a visual. But if that visual isn't visual, it's not a visual anymore. Oh yeah, the maps in this book were just terrible. That is easily the weakest point of this book. Again, like, it is 93. Who knows where he got these maps from? And it is a small press book, so he probably didn't have the resources that he could have had to be able to make that more legible. But even so, if you're going to do that, just don't include the maps. Otherwise, though, it was a fun book. It wasn't super well written, but the content and the perspective I really enjoyed, for sure.
Do you know, is he still heralded in Russia as a...
Oh, Zhukov is one of those guys everybody can like, because he stood
Even
up
today?
He stood up to Stalin. He received ridiculous amounts of medals. I think he was given the honorific Hero of the Soviet Union 4 times, if I recall correctly. Wow. He regularly crusaded to have the people in charge of him not make stupid commands to his troops so that less of them would die. He's one of those people that everybody is allowed to like.
It'd be interesting to see if he had actually been put in charge, how far the Cold War would have gone.
He would have still been a strongman leader, for sure. He would have been a dictator, I think.
But with Eisenhower, he might have been able to communicate
I think
better.
So. He didn't really, I think, value nuclear weapons.
Okay.
I think. That's the picture I got anyway. One of the reasons that he was brought up on charges the second time, his last exile, was he had started building saboteur schools that were answerable to him. Now, clearly they needed this kind of stuff because it is the Cold War starting up. They needed to have an army because the army was getting smaller and smaller and smaller because they're not at World War II anymore.
Sure.
So they needed something, but I think he would have valued traditional warfare over nuclear warfare. Whereas Eisenhower's tactic was to value nuclear warfare over traditional warfare. I don't think that we would have had as much of the land grab in World War II as we did. It would have been very interesting to see what would have happened there, yeah.
Sounds like a good book.
It was a good book. It was a good book. I enjoyed it.
I'm glad you read it and told me about it. Now I don't have to.
One other thing, too, I should mention, too, in Zhukov's life, where whenever a year ends in 7, something either really bad happens to him or something really good happens to him.
Oh, the 70s must have been terrible. Ends in 7.
He died in 74, yeah. They were terrible for him. But in 1937, he survives the purges and is promoted. That's pretty good. In 1947, he is demoted down again the first time. In 1957, he is brought back up again to the top of his career. In, I think, 1967, the stress of having to do all the rewrites in his memoirs causes a heart attack that kind of begins his decline in health.
And, I mean, the Beatles were breaking up.
We were all upset about that.
Oh, Zhukov took it the hardest, I think.
I remember Zhukov came in while we were playing the tavern. He said, "Hey, Ringo, you're great."
Mind if I hop on the guitar?
We had him play the drums, actually, for the White Album a few times. It was great.
He blames Yoko, too. But
Yoko drove him out. He was always considered the 5th Beatle. When I wrote Octopus's Garden, it was actually about Zhukov.
Not his garden.
He was a real gardener.
He invited me to his house.
He had 8 arms.
So the book that I chose for this episode is Born Standing Up by Steve Martin. If you have seen such classics as Cheaper by the Dozen or Cheaper by the Dozen 2, you know who Steve Martin is.
Or the Muppet Movie, or...
More of his famous ones are The Jerk or The Three Amigos.
Dead Men Don't Wear Plaid.
He was on SNL with Dan Aykroyd as a wild and crazy guy. He has such a long life ahead of that. This is his autobiography. He has, like, black hair. For most of the parts that we know him for, he is just a, like, white-haired fella.
Now, did you notice that young Steve Martin looks a little bit like Harrison Ford?
I did notice that. They do have photos throughout this of Steve in his life.
Are they legible, like the ones that aren't in my book?
It's him at a studio, but it's taken from the back row, so you can't really see him.
It's him in the studio, but it was taken from the bathroom, so you can't see anything but the bathroom wall.
Steve Martin actually got his start at 10 years old. He heard that this new park, Disneyland, had opened up in California, just like 5 miles from where he had lived. His friend told him, they're hiring kids our age and that selling maps for $0.25 and you make $2 for every map.
Wow, that's amazing. They're selling maps for $0.25.
I don't know how Disney made money that first year.
There's a reason they had to shut down Euro Disney.
Because of Steve Martin? No, he'd make 2 cents on every quarter map that he sold.
And 2 cents back then was like having $1,000.
Yes. And so he got his start there. During his breaks, he would just walk through the park because he already had free admission. And he became infatuated with this magic shop. And so he'd spend all his free time there. And then he started saving up all his money. And he'd start buying magic tricks. And so he was a frequent customer. When he got too old to sell the maps, he got a job in this magic shop.
Oh, adorable.
And so, like, the magician there was a really nice guy just teaching him all these tricks and how to do it.
I think we can all agree, no matter what place you are in life, no matter how successful you become, you're still not a magic shop owner at Disneyland. And that is the pinnacle a man could possibly reach. I think that is...
Yeah, I mean, Steven is a world-class comedian, but he was never
still
the
stuck in that
owner
magic
of a
shop.
magician.
The owner of a magician.
Of a magic shop.
I believe that's better than the owner of a lonely heart. I believe that's how that works, right? The owner of a magician is better than the owner of a lonely heart?
Yeah, those are lyrics.
That's how it works.
Anyway, back to my book.
Shut up, Sam. I'm trying to do a podcast over here.
You had your turn. This is Bryce's time. And so from there, he, in his teenage years working there, he really enjoys the ability to show off to people. And like, he actually starts booking himself with like the Kiwanis clubs, doing these like the 5-minute magic shows.
Right.
There's actually a photo of him doing magic. And it's like, why would these clubs hire me? Thought about it. And the only reason is because they were nice. Like, he wasn't...
How old is he doing this?
He's like 15 years old.
Oh, the most awkward stage for a magician.
Yeah, his voice is probably cracking.
If you're like 12 or less, it's cute that you're a magician. If you are, say, 20 and older and actually good at magic, that's great. But also that middle stage of being a teenage magician.
But also, then you're like a 20-something-year-old magician, and there's not a lot to brag there, so...
Oh, I disagree, Bryce.
Where did Sam go? So there's a photo of him.
It hasn't changed a bit.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's still identifiably Steve Martin at any age.
I was going to say, even from a young age, you can tell, oh, this is Steve Martin.
This is clearly Steve Martin.
His face hasn't aged, which is a very big compliment to him. So from there was a small theater that was at the Disney park, and he was able to do some of his magic tricks there. And as he got older, he moved over to Knoxbury Farms, if you've heard of that. It's a park just down the road from Disney. They aren't as popular, but they do have like...
Sorry, kids, we couldn't go to Disney this year.
Can we go to Knoxbury Farms, Dad? They're just as good. Well, okay.
I haven't heard of this place at all. They have knockoff characters in costume running around.
Mackie Mouse.
Instead of Pluto, it's Hades. The not-so-magic kingdom.
Only we could have that.
Instead of the haunted mansion, it's the perfectly normal mansion. You just walk around trying to get scared.
Is that asbestos in the ceiling? So yeah, not as popular as Disney.
I don't know. I think after our description, I'd rather go to this one. I want to spend a day in the second most happy place on earth.
Instead of Tomorrowland, it's Todayland. It's just a
stuff.
park. It's a park.
It's a furniture showroom.
And there's CNN on the TV.
Could have just gone to, I don't know.
The living room.
Yeah, all set.
It's like I'm really in my house. The present. Ooh.
The not so wild kingdom. It's just
like cats.
It's a petting zoo. Yeah, cats and a dog and a hamster running around.
He got his start there, and he actually went from Disney to Knoxbury Farms, joined their theater group, and that's where he became more of a theatrical individual.
Oh, okay.
But he keeps name-dropping people. So I think if you read this book, you might know the actors and more. Like the first one that I actually recognized, like, hey, I know that one, was Rob Reiner, and that was towards the end of the book as the director. And so he spends his time, it's called The Birdcage, in Knoxbury Farms is their theater. And that's where he starts working on his comedy, and he starts mixing that in with his magic. And he realizes, I don't want to be so much a magician as I do a entertainer.
Right.
And so he starts really working on his comedy. He starts going out of the park to different small towns. They didn't really have comedy clubs back then. And so it was just like open mic nights that he'd have to show up. Then he gets picked up by the Tonight Show with Johnny Carson.
Oh, wow.
And and it's the first time you're on the Tonight Show, no one's going to remember you. And the second time, no one's going to remember you. The sixth time, you might get a, hey, don't I know you from somewhere? He said it wasn't until his 16th time on the Tonight Show with Johnny Carson, a woman was in a store, and he walked into the store, and she said, hey, weren't you that young boy on the Tonight Show last night? And he said, yes, I was. And she said, yuck.
But she remembered him.
That's right.
And that's what matters. I guess that's why he dyed his hair white. Made him more distinctive.
Well, that is why he's wearing a white suit.
Oh, okay.
A lot of time just to make him stand out, especially when his crowds got bigger and bigger.
Yeah.
He wanted to be able to stand out better on a stage.
That makes sense. That makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay. Not just running Fantasy Island. There's a reason for the white suit.
And he gets to the point that he asked like the stagehand, how many people are out there tonight? And it's like, 1,000 people. It's like 1,000 people. The chapter goes on. It's like 10,000 people. And suddenly he's being booked not in like these underground coffee shops, but in football stadiums. I think he said the most he did in one day was 45,000 people.
Wow.
Like in 2 different cities, the combined total. It's like that many people. You know, a lot of his stuff is visual, like playing with stuff on stage. Like one of his favorite jokes is to put his nose on the microphone and just hold it there. And it's like, okay, moving on. He didn't want to like be able to snap your fingers and that's when you laugh. Like most comedians. He didn't want it to be, I told the joke, now it's your turn to laugh. Okay, let's move on to the next one and repeat. It was, I'm going to make an awkward situation, build up that tension, and you just have to let out your laughter whenever it is. And one of the things, though, with his visual comedy, when he's doing these big stadiums, he has to realize, I can't be doing a balloon trick because someone like half a mile away can't even see me. He just go from stadium to hotel, wait in the hotel, then go into the bus, go to the next city, and repeat. And he was doing this all by himself, and it was really just making him depressed, being so worn down because it's just...
Well, touring's hard. Yeah. Touring's hard anyway,
It drives him pretty crazy and drives him apart from his family. And so he's like, I'm just done touring. And so that actually started his movie career. He's like, I still want to entertain. I didn't want to tour. And so what he did was he started writing the script for The Jerk.
Is this book a biography of him, or is it just a story of his stand-up comedy days, or does it continue into the present? What's the span of this book?
I'd say a lot of it is about his stand-up and like how I came from here to this point I am now. But I'd say the other half of the book is dealing with the issue that he had with his father his entire life of not having the family support. Like his father was never proud of him. His father was verbally abusive to him as a child. His mother was just too afraid to stand up to the father. And so she saw all this happening and did nothing about it. His sister... saw it all happening, but they weren't the brunt of the force. It was Steve Martin that got all this, and at one point he did get physically abusive towards his son. And there's a few points throughout the book he's like, I tried to reconnect with my father, but he was still never proud. Whereas when Steve Martin became famous, he was driving down Rodeo Drive with his mother, and she said, get out and walk on the streets, and I want to see how people react to you. Like she was just so proud.
Classic mom.
Of who he was. He was like,
get out of the car.
It's funny, my mom did that to me the other day, and she just drove off. And so, towards the very end of the book, his father's dying, and so he tries to work on that relationship. And like he forced himself every week to have lunch with his family, his parents, and that helped grow them closer.
When was that?
This would have been the 90s.
Okay.
I think. He's finally able to make that connection with his father, and his father apologizes for not having been a better father. He finally says, I'm proud of who you are. And
have you read anything else by Steve Martin? This is your first book by him?
This is my first book by him, yeah.
Okay. If you enjoyed his writing style, you might enjoy Pure Drivel, which is his book of articles he wrote for The New Yorker, which are all humorous. They're all quite humorous, you see. Quite good.
The New Yorker.
But they're all really, really funny. One of my favorite ones is Side Effects, where he just says, take twice a day for body pain. Side effects include, and then it's just 3 pages of just the most bizarre possible side effects you could get from this medicine. It's great. If you want to borrow a copy, I have Pure Drivel in book form, and it's one of the few audio books I actually listen to because it's read by Steve Martin. It's really good. I would recommend it. Book recommendation fanfare.
Instead of my book that I'm currently doing and failing.
How do you do as an author? Did it flow well? Did he describe things adequately?
I think he did a great job, especially towards the acknowledgement section. He said, at each stage of this book, I had to spread out my friends. I hate to make them read my manuscript twice. And I apologize to the friends who had to read it early when it was just nothing good. It's a really good page turner. You end up reading
turning pages
20, 30 pages before you even realize like,
that's good.
I've just gotten through a huge chunk of this, and it's entertaining and just keeps the pages going.
Is biography something that you tend to read?
Not really. I was trying to look at my bookshelf, and I really don't have any audio biographies or any biographies whatsoever. And honestly, when I look at like a library book sale or like in a bookstore or something like that, I think it's this book that I hold them up against.
Sure.
So if it has to be an individual I actually care about.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Although it would be really fun to get like a biography for like, I don't know, Nipsey Russell or Bob Barker or something like that. And just, really next month on Book Report's podcast, the life and times of Fred Gwynn, the dad from Munsters. See,
Don Most.
I don't tend to read biographies either, unless it's somebody I'm really, really interested in. Like, if it's the biography of, say, a famous spy, then I will. Sure. That's like the only biographies I tend to read.
Do you think you would read this book, being that it's Steve Martin?
I'm a Steve Martin fan. I probably would read it. Now, Bryce.
Yes.
We have something that we tend to do every single book.
Yes.
It's something you could just darn well do by yourself and just tell me. But since you insist on me asking you about it, Bryce,
Yes.
was there anything about this book you didn't like?
I did not expect that question. Oh boy. I'm glad you asked.
Actually, I lost interest.
We'll see you next week.
Bye, everybody. Bye. What didn't you like about this book?
Okay, that's a good question. I'm glad you asked. The book ends before he even starts getting into the Three Amigos. This is copywritten in 2007, so he had plenty of time to talk about it. He, in the movie, he does some rope tricks and stuff like that.
Yeah.
He mentions that he learned those in Disneyland, and then even Johnny Carson says, everything you've ever learned, you're going to use. Mm-hmm. And it's like, I used that rope trick in Three Amigos. So he mentions Three Amigos.
Right.
Like, that's where he met Martin Short.
Right.
And that's where they became very close friends. And then even though they're touring together, and he mentions being on the SNL with Chevy Chase, he doesn't really mention liking Chevy Chase, which I can't imagine.
Wonder why that wasn't discussed.
He doesn't really attack anyone in this book. He says he got along with Dan Aykroyd, but they weren't friends. Like, they liked each other, but not enough to actually be friends because they had different styles of comedy. And so that's probably the most stabbing he gets at another person. So I can see why he wouldn't talk about Chevy Chase, because Chevy Chase can be a very hard individual to work with, from what they say. I don't know personally.
Just try getting him on the podcast. It's not easy, let me tell you.
That's why we don't have a guest.
Chevy Chase backed out at the last second. Well, folks, that just about does it for this episode of Book Reports Podcast. I'd like to thank our guests, but, well, shoot, we didn't have one. So, Bryce, thanks for doing this podcast with me.
Thanks. You sound like Bing Crosby.
Well, that's very true, my friend. When the noon of the night. Anyway, thank you for being on the podcast with me.
And you're welcome. Hey, Sam.
Yeah, Bryce.
Thanks for being on the podcast.
You're welcome. Quite welcome. Always happy to do the podcast with you, Bryce. This has been fun.
It's kind of your job, so.
It kind of sounds like this is becoming the ending episode, isn't it? It sounds like we're
well, listeners, I have some bad news for
I'm going to wake up in bed next to Emily.
Is that the horse head?
Bob Newhart's show. That's how the end of Newhart was. He woke up with Emily, his wife. And
none of our listeners are going to get that reference, and they're going to say,
my mom and sister listen to the show. Thank you very much. They're going to get it.
Oh, good. Two laughs. That's just what we got there. It's 2 laughs.
It's one more than we usually get. If you enjoyed that bit of the podcast, and I'm not sure why, you can find even more of just like it on YouTube and SoundCloud and iTunes and Facebook. Please rate and review us wherever you can find our podcasts. You can find them wherever delicious podcasts are served. You can contact us and tell us we've done a great job, or anything else you might want to say, not sure what else you'd want to say, at bookreportspodcast@gmail.com. You can find more of me, and who doesn't want that, at skullduggeryinthesmoke.blogspot.com, which is my blog for all my game writing. Our show music is by Kevin MacLeod. You can find more of his music at incompetech.com.
I'm Bryce Diener.
I was going to say, I got everything right. That was it. It feels like I rushed through it.
Because I'm Bryce Diener. Okay. And I'm Bryce Diener. We'll see you, Bryce Diener. Next, Bryce Diener.
Bryce Diener, everybody.
Bryce Reports Podcast.
Bryce Diener.
By Bryce Diener. Featuring Bryce Diener.
Bryce Diener. Well, Bryce Diener, everybody. Bryce Diener. Bryce Diener.
And I'm Sam. Toto references. Toto references. Toto. References.
References. That is the worst. I mean, you can hear the spit drops hitting the microphone. That's awful.